I remember the day my heart first cracked open, not in the way a vase shatters suddenly on marble, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the way a river carves its way through stone over 1,000 years. It was not an extraordinary day by any external measure. The sky had dressed itself in a clear, cloudless blue, the kind of sky that makes you think nothing could possibly go wrong beneath it. Konya pulsed with its usual rhythms. The call to prayer rose like incense over the rooftops. Traders haggled over spices and fabrics, and children ran barefoot through the alleyways, their laughter echoing off the stone. I was walking through the market district, returning from the seminary, my arms full of scrolls, my mind busy with the layered complexities of theology and metaphysics. I was so preoccupied with thought, so full of words and doctrines and the safe security of knowledge, that I nearly missed it. It was a sound that stopped me, soft and delicate, yet unmistakably full of sorrow. A child's cry. But not the cry of a child demanding sweets or attention. No, this sound was hollow and haunting, like the final note of a flute trailing off into the void. It was a sound that came not from the throat but from the soul, the kind of cry that does not seek answers but simply seeks to be heard. It cut through the noise of the bazaar, sharper than any knife, and in that single sound, all my thoughts were silenced. I turned instinctively, my feet carrying me away from the familiar stalls of fruits and fabrics, past the shouting vendors and the clamor of trade, until I came to a quieter corner near the steps of an old bathhouse, where the shadows of the day stretched long and tired. There, hunched in the crook of a wall where no one had bothered to look, was a small girl. She could not have been older than 6 or 7. Her feet were bare, her knees scraped, and her dress, once perhaps a joyful color, was now dulled by dust and sorrow. But it was not her appearance that undid me. It was the way she held a piece of cloth, just a torn, faded sleeve, and rocked slightly as if trying to comfort something within herself. The cloth, I realized, had once been part of a robe, a woman's robe, perhaps her mother's. And the way her fingers gripped it, tightly, desperately, was the way a drowning person might cling to driftwood. I knelt before her slowly, as if entering sacred ground. My lips parted, but no words emerged. What could I possibly say? What words would not sound hollow, even cruel, in the face of such innocent desolation? So I said nothing. I simply sat there, on the hard stone ground beside her, allowing my silence to speak what words could not. She did not look at me. Her gaze remained somewhere far away, beyond the square, beyond the city, perhaps beyond this world entirely. And still, she rocked, and still, she clutched the sleeve. In that moment, I felt something within me, a quiet, ancient wall, begin to crumble. I had lived most of my life surrounded by certainties, the certainty of scripture, the certainty of ritual, the certainty of my role as a teacher, a jurist, a guide. My heart had been shaped by rules and structures, encased in the careful protection of scholarship and lineage. And yet, here in the presence of a grieving child, all of that certainty vanished like mist under sunlight. I felt it, not metaphorically, but truly, as if my chest had been torn open and something unseen and unnamed had been released. Pain, deep, personal, and untraceable, rose like smoke from an invisible fire. I wanted to take her pain into me, to lift it from her tiny shoulders and bear it as my own. But in truth, what I really felt was that her pain was my own, that she had shown me a wound I had long buried beneath layers of intellect and piety. I saw myself in her, the young boy I once was, standing at the edge of life and death when I lost my mother, staring at the immensity of grief without knowing its name. I had never allowed myself to truly mourn her, not in the way grief asks to be honored, with openness, with surrender. Instead, I had buried it beneath discipline, beneath duty. And here, decades later, this girl's quiet despair reached down into the depths of that old sorrow and pulled it to the surface with aching clarity. Time slowed. The bustle of the city receded into silence. In that moment, there was only her wound and mine. Two human hearts, one small and new to pain, the other aged and practiced in concealing it, now laid bare in the soft amber of the dying sun. I reached out, not to touch her, but simply to let my presence say, I see you. I seal you. You are not alone. She did not respond, but she did not move away either. That was enough. That silent agreement, that sacred stillness, was a kind of communion. And in it, I felt the unmistakable sensation of something flowing into the space of that wound, a warmth, a light, so soft I almost doubted it. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was understanding. A glimmer of something divine, entering not through wisdom or virtue, but through this very pain that had opened me like a door. The light did not erase the wound. It entered through it. It required it. That night, I could not eat. I did not light the lamp in my study. I sat in the dark for hours, haunted not by the child's tears, but by the mirror she had unknowingly held up to me. My soul was stirred in a way that no sermon, no philosophy, no book had ever managed. I kept seeing her face, not her features, but the vastness of her sorrow. And the more I saw it, the more I realized that the wound she bore had passed into me, or perhaps awakened the one I had always carried and never truly embraced. This was the moment my journey began, not the journey of the feet, but the journey inward. The sacred turning toward the self I had long neglected, the soul that had waited quietly beneath the surface of scholarship and structure, whispering patiently, break, and I will come through. Yes, this was the day my heart first cracked open. And though it hurt, oh, how it hurt, it also brought with it a strange peace, the kind that does not come from answers but from the willingness to sit in silence beside the mystery. That day, I learned that sometimes the divine knocks not through ecstasy or revelation, but through a small child's grief. And when we let that grief in, when we stop running from it and allow it to wound us, it becomes the very passage through which the light finds us. I remember the day my heart first cracked open, not shattered all at once, but split slowly, with the gentleness of something ancient breaking free from beneath the surface. It was not a day that anyone else would have marked as significant. The city of Konya moved along its usual rhythm, cloaked in the rustle of market chatter and the scent of cinnamon, roasted chickpeas, and old dust. The morning sun had long passed its peak, casting golden threads through the minarets, wrapping the city in a hush that usually arrived only before the call to ASR prayer. I walked through those familiar alleys, my feet light, my hands occupied with scrolls of sacred commentary I had planned to read later in the solitude of my study. But that solitude never came, at least not in the way I had expected. What came instead was a stillness that would change the very nature of who I was. I was a man of learning then, more scholar than mystic, more preacher than poet. My days were full of structure and my thoughts clothed in certainty. Students came to me with their questions about the divine, about jurisprudence, about the complexities of scripture and law. And I answered them with confidence, with practiced cadence, weaving knowledge into finely woven cloth. I believed myself whole. I believed that mastery of knowledge brought mastery of the soul. But the soul does not reveal itself through answers. It waits patiently for the right question. And sometimes, it takes a wound to ask it. That wound arrived on feet barely taller than a bundle of firewood. As I passed the steps of the old stone bathhouse near the edge of the marketplace, I heard it, a sound so quiet it nearly drowned in the shuffling of feet and the hum of daily life. A cry. Faint, hoarse, and utterly alone. Not the sharp scream of injury, but the quiet, persistent weeping of someone who has forgotten what comfort feels like. I turned instinctively. I do not know why, perhaps because sorrow speaks in a universal tongue that the soul always hears, even when the ears do not. I followed the sound into a shaded alcove where the merchant seldom lingered, and there I saw her. She was sitting on the bare stone, knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in a piece of torn cloth that looked too large for her frame. The cloth was frayed and stained, and she held it with the desperate grip of someone clinging to memory. She could not have been more than 6. Her hair was tangled, her feet bare, and her silence, the spaces between her sobs, spoke volumes. There were no adults around, no one searching for her. She was utterly alone in that moment, alone in a way that goes beyond physical solitude. And as I stood there, watching her grieve into that fabric, something ancient within me stirred. A door long closed creaked open, and something cold and unfinished slipped through. I approached slowly, feeling the weight of something far heavier than I could name pressing on my chest. I had spoken to kings. I had addressed gatherings of scholars. I had answered theological dilemmas with ease. But now, in the presence of this little girl, I felt completely voiceless. She did not see me, or perhaps she did and chose not to acknowledge me. Her entire being was wrapped around that sleeve, just a scrap of someone who was no longer there. I knew in that instant that it had belonged to someone she had loved, someone who had cared for her. A mother, perhaps. A sister. Someone who had vanished so recently the wound had not even scabbed. I knelt beside her, not to speak, but simply to be near her. It was not a gesture of rescue. I knew instinctively that she did not need rescuing, she needed witnessing. So I sat there, on the cool stone, letting the silence settle between us. In that silence, something extraordinary happened. I felt the barrier between us dissolve. Her grief became mine. Not in an intellectual, abstract way, but in the way a well overflows when a stone drops into its depths. She did not know me, and I did not know the details of her sorrow, but in that moment, we knew each other in the most sacred way two souls can know one another, through shared pain. A memory surfaced, uninvited, from the depths of my own childhood. I was no older than she was, standing in the courtyard after my mother's passing, watching the servants whisper, the neighbors murmur, the sun retreat. I remembered holding her shawl the same way this girl clutched the sleeve, inhaling a scent that would soon fade from fabric. I had buried that memory beneath decades of study and discipline, had stacked theology and structure atop it like stones on a grave. But now, in the presence of this child's unfiltered sorrow, the stones tumbled away, and the memory breathed again. I had never mourned my mother. Not fully. I had never allowed myself to feel the wound she left behind. I had built a fortress around it and called it strength. But it was not strength. It was fear. And so, sitting beside that girl, I began to cry. I did not sob. I did not shake. The tears simply came, silent and hot, slipping down my cheeks without struggle. They were not only for her. They were for me. For the boy I once was. For the grief I had sealed away like a forbidden book. For the illusion I had lived under, that knowledge could replace feeling, that mastery of doctrine could protect the heart from breaking. The world around us moved on. Horses clopped along cobbled roads. Vendors haggled over bread. The mosque minarets stood tall and indifferent. But I remained beside her, as if tethered by something older than time. At some point, she stopped crying. She looked at me, really looked, and in her gaze I saw something astonishing. Not confusion, not fear, but recognition. As if she understood that I, too, was broken in a way that needed no explanation. She did not speak. She did not smile. But she offered me something greater than words, presence. In her silence, I felt a prayer being answered. One I had never known I was praying. Eventually, she stood and walked away, disappearing into the maze of streets, her little hand still holding the sleeve like a talisman. I never saw her again. But she remained with me, woven into the fabric of my being like a thread of gold hidden beneath wool. That night, I could not bring myself to open the scrolls I had carried home. I did not eat. I did not speak. I sat in the dark with my hands over my heart, feeling it beat around the fresh opening, the rawness that now lived where once there had only been certainty. And there, in the quiet, in the dark, in the ache, I felt something else. Not a voice, not a vision, but a presence, a nuance, a knowing. It came not as an answer, but as an invitation. Do not close this wound. Do not seal it away. For it is through this wound that the light will enter. It was then that I began to understand. This pain was not a mistake. It was not a weakness. It was the very door through which the divine had chosen to reach me. It was the place where grace would pour in, where love would break through, where truths would be born. And so, for the first time in my life, I did not resist the pain. I welcomed it, because the wound was no longer something to hide. It was something sacred. It was not until many years later that I could look back and say with certainty, that day was the beginning of my real life. Not the life I had lived up until then, of scholarship, of respect, of certainty, and religious stature, but the life that comes when one's soul has been truly touched by pain, stripped of its armor, and made to kneel before the unknown. But at the time, on that particular day, I did not know I was being transformed. I did not understand that the crack forming in my chest would one day become the opening through which the beloved would pour infinite light. At the time, all I knew was that something had been dislodged in me. Something quiet, something devastating, something sacred. After the child walked away, still clutching that worn sleeve like a relic of a lost world, I remained seated in the shaded alcove for what felt like hours. I do not recall the sounds of the marketplace anymore, or the footsteps that passed me by, or even the changing of the light as the sun drifted across the sky. The world had gone silent around me, though not empty. It was as if all the noise had retreated to make space for something deeper to speak. Inside me, an ocean had stirred. I could feel its currents rising. I could feel its waves crashing into the brittle structures I had built across my life to protect myself from precisely this sort of vulnerability. And now, those structures were eroding with each breath. I eventually returned to my house, but I was not the same man who had left it that morning. I moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, touching the walls, the books, the rugs, the lanterns, as though seeing them for the first time. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I sat before the low writing table where I had composed hundreds of letters and sermons, the ink pot still half full, the reed pen resting in its groove. I reached for it out of habit, but my hand hesitated. What could I possibly write now? What words could I summon that would not feel false or distant after what I had felt in that alley? Instead, I laid the pen aside and pressed my hand to my heart. It still ached, deep, constant, and sharp, like a wound that had not yet begun to scab. And yet, it wasn't the ache of despair. It was the ache of something trying to awaken inside me. Something ancient and buried, something I had silenced through years of intellectual pride. I had spent so long trying to rise above pain, to transcend it through knowledge, to conquer it through spiritual discipline. But now I saw pain for what it truly was, not a thing to be defeated, but a thing to be entered, embraced, and lived through. The child had not just been grieving. She had been mirroring my own grief I had never allowed myself to touch. The loss of my mother in my early years had torn a gash through my soul that I had never properly mourned. I had buried it under scripture, under sermons, under the applause of students and the praise of the city. I had tried to pray it away, reason it away, outgrow it. But grief does not dissolve on its own. It waits, patiently, quietly, until life gives you no choice but to face it. And that day, that child's sorrow had become the mirror in which I finally saw my own. I wept again that night, softly, freely, not in the darkness of shame, but in the dim candlelight of honesty. The tears fell into my beard, onto my robe, soaking the fabric without apology. I was not embarrassed. I was not afraid. I felt, for the first time, what it meant to be truly alive. Not just to breathe, not just to exist, not just to function, but to feel, to allow the full weight of sorrow to rest in my chest without resistance. And in that surrender, something beautiful happened. I felt the faintest flicker of light enter me, not the external light of a sunbeam or a lantern, but the internal light that comes when the soul has been cracked open wide enough for love to enter. It was not immediate. It did not banish the pain. But it arrived all the same, like a whisper of warmth in the cold room of my heart. I could feel it, ever so slightly, beginning to illuminate the dark corners I had long ignored. And I realized then that light does not always come to those who seek it in brilliance and splendor. Sometimes it finds its way in through the smallest of openings, through a single sob, a single shared silence, a single moment of presence beside a grieving child. Sometimes light requires a wound to make its entrance. In the days that followed, I no longer sought to fix what I felt. I did not rush to cover the wound. I did not hide my softness from others. When my students came to me, I listened differently. I no longer rushed to provide answers. I allowed silence to bloom between us. I allowed their questions to echo within me, unchallenged. I no longer needed to appear invincible. I understood now that the soul does not seek a perfect teacher, but a truthful one. And truth, I learned, is born not in the perfection of knowledge, but in the vulnerability of pain. When I walked the streets of Konya, I no longer saw crowds. I saw souls. Souls wrapped in layers of experience, each carrying hidden wounds behind their eyes. The merchant arguing over the price of figs, the old woman feeding birds with a tremble in her hands, the boy who limped as he ran to catch his friends. I saw them all not as characters in the city of my life, but as mirrors. Each one reflecting some part of my own brokenness, each one bearing their own silent wound. And in each, I began to feel a strange connection, a thread running between us, spun not of doctrine or identity, but of shared suffering. It was then I began to understand what compassion truly meant. Not kindness, not sympathy, but presence, a willingness to enter another's suffering without needing to fix it. That is what the child had given me. Not her story, not her name, not her trust, but her pain. She had offered it to me without words, and I, for the first time, had dared to accept it. And in doing so, she gave me a gift more powerful than any scroll, any sermon, any spiritual ecstasy. She gave me back my own humanity. And so I lived with the wound. I tended it like a garden, gently, patiently. I no longer prayed for it to disappear. I prayed only that I might learn from it, that it might remain open just wide enough for the light to continue entering, that it might keep me tender, keep me honest, keep me near the truth of who I was beneath the robes, the wisdom, the reverence. I began to write again, but not to teach. I wrote to seal, to give shape to the storm within me. And in those lines, the light deepened. The wound began to sing. Years later, when the verses poured from my mouth like rain from a swollen sky, and people gathered to listen to what they called poetry, I would remember that moment in the alley. That moment with the child. That small, silent earthquake in my soul. And I would know every word that followed, every verse, every metaphor, every flame and every rose, it all began with a wound. A sacred tear in the heart. The place where the beloved had first entered. And so I say, with reverence, the wound is the place where the light enters you. Not just my wound, not just once, but yours too, always. The days turned to weeks, and the ache never left. It did not fade, nor did it intensify. It simply remained, constant and unwavering, like a thread tied from my heart to something invisible, something infinitely tender, yet infinitely vast. I began to live as though the entire world were constructed of silence, and I was finally learning to hear it. The laughter of children in the street no longer sounded the same. It had an edge now, a fine golden tremble that made me pause and wonder whether behind it lay the kind of sorrow that doesn't speak. The cry of a street vendor, once just noise and the din of the market, now felt like a hymn. The wind in the trees, the scrape of a sandal against stone, even the drip of water from the mosque fountain, each one arrived in me differently. As though my senses had been softened by the wound, as though the injury had stripped away the callus that had built up between me and the world. Before the wound, I had moved through life like a man with a map, confident, purposeful, certain of where he was going. But after, I began to move like a man walking in a dream, or perhaps one who had just woken from it. There was no more map, no more certainty, but I had never felt more real. I remember visiting the grave of my father one afternoon. The sky had grown gray, and the cypress trees bowed like old men under the wind. I knelt before the stone, my fingers brushing the carved letters of his name. I had visited this grave many times over the years, always with formality, always with dutiful recitations and the composed grief of a son who had become a religious man. But this time was different. I sat beside the grave like a child sitting by his father's feet, no prayers on my lips, only silence in my mouth and a storm behind my eyes. "Baba," I whispered, I thought I understood life. I thought I understood the soul. But I knew nothing. And the wind seemed to answer, to know, you must be unmade. I stayed for hours, watching the shadows stretch, watching the leaves fall and spin in circles on the soil. I wept, not because I missed him more than before, but because the part of me that had always longed for him was now uncovered. I wept because I could finally admit that I still wished for his arms, still wished for the comfort of being a son, not a teacher, not a scholar, not a man of status, just a boy aching for warmth. I had spent so long trying to be strong, believing that grief made me weak. But now I knew it was grief that had kept me alive. It was grief that had kept me human. When I walked home that evening, I passed the bathhouse again, the same one where I had seen the girl. I paused, half expecting to see her again. But the corner was empty. The shadows had changed. Still, the space held her memory, as though the sorrow she had poured into the stones had seeped into them and stayed. I sat there, as I had before, and closed my eyes. And this time, I saw myself there, younger, silent, weeping. I saw all the versions of myself I had ever buried. Rumi the child, Rumi the grieving son, Rumi the lost student, Rumi the silent mourner. They came one by one, sitting beside me, not as burdens but as brothers. I did not push them away. I let them gather around me like a quiet council of the soul. And the wound inside my chest pulsed gently, not with pain, but with presence. That was when I realized the wound was not just a wound. It was a gathering place, a sacred hollow carved into the soul where all the parts of me could finally meet, where joy and sorrow could sit beside each other without argument, where light and darkness could exist in the same breath. That night, I wrote again. The ink bled faster now, as though the words had been waiting all along but could only pass through me once I had been broken open enough to let them through. This pain you feel is a messenger. Listen to it. Don't run away from the wound. The wound is the doorway. Through this door, the beloved will come. You think you are being torn apart, but in truth, you are being opened. The verses poured through me like river water. I could not keep up. My hand moved furiously, but I felt as though it were not even mine. I was only the flute now. Something was playing through me. Something divine. I began to speak differently to those who came to me. People still arrived with questions about the divine, about the afterlife, about destiny and doubt. But now, I asked them questions in return. Where does it hurt? I would ask. And if they answered with their minds, would gently lead them back to their hearts. Not there, I'd whisper. Here, tell me where your soul aches. Only then can the answer find you. They looked at me strangely at first. Some recoiled. Some wept. Some returned days later with trembling lips and stories they had never told another living soul. Stories of loss, of longing, of hidden sorrow and buried dreams. I listened, and I did not try to fix them. I simply sat with them the way I had sat with the girl. With silence, with presence, with the wound open between us like a sacred fire. And I learned this, when two wounded souls sit together in honesty, light does not just pass from one to the other, it multiplies. It spreads. It grows luminous. It fills the room. It becomes a prayer made of breath and gaze and stillness. That was when people began to call me a mystic. They said I had changed. That my words were different. That my poetry felt like fire and water at once. I smiled when they said this, not because I had become someone new, but because I had finally become myself. The wound had not destroyed me. It had uncovered me. And now, whenever I see someone hurting, eyes lowered, shoulders heavy, voice brittle with unspoken things, I say nothing at first. I only breathe with them. I only listen. And if they let me, I say, as gently as I can, "Beloved, do not cover your pain. Do not fear this breaking. This wound, it is not a flaw. It is the entrance." And sometimes their eyes fill with tears. Sometimes they look away. But always the light begins to enter, just as it once entered me, and still does. The wound lingered, persistent and unrelenting, threading itself into every moment of my days and nights. It was not a mere injury to be bandaged or forgotten, but an ever-present companion, a living ache that pulsed beneath my ribs like a second heartbeat. I had long since ceased to ask why it had come to me or what sin or failing it might have punished. Instead, I learned slowly, painfully, to welcome it as one welcomes a messenger from a distant land, an unexpected guest bearing news both terrible and beautiful. In the first months after the wound opened, I sought solitude more often. Not out of shame or despair, but because the silence seemed the only place where I could hear the subtle murmurs that now filled my inner world. My study, once cluttered with books and scrolls, became a sanctuary where I could sit for hours without moving, watching the shifting patterns of light on the walls, listening to the faint rustle of paper and the soft footsteps of servants passing by. Time itself stretched and curved differently there, becoming a vast landscape in which grief and light moved in tandem. One afternoon, as a soft rain began to fall, I found myself wandering through the garden that surrounded my home. The earth was damp and fragrant, the roses bowed beneath the weight of water, their petals glistening like jewels. I knelt beside one that had been battered by wind and rain, its stem bent but its blossoms still vivid. As I touched the fragile flower, my heart cracked open again, and the tears came, slow, steady, and cleansing. In that moment, I understood something profound. The rose was not less beautiful for its scars and bruises. In fact, it was the very imperfection of the bloom that made its existence more miraculous. So too, the wound inside me was not a mark of weakness or failure, but a place where life's deepest truths might enter. I began to write more earnestly during those days, pouring words onto parchment not as declarations of knowledge, but as the breathings of a heart broken open. The ink flowed unevenly, like blood, and sometimes the tears blurred the letters. I wrote of love and loss, of sorrow and hope, of light emerging from darkness. My poetry no longer sought to explain the mysteries of the universe, but to live within them, to hold their contradictions without needing to resolve them. I discovered that the wound was a wellspring, a sacred space from which the most honest truths arose, truths that could not be taught but only felt. My students noticed the change in me. Some were puzzled, others concerned, but all were drawn in by the new tenderness that colored my voice and softened the edges of my teachings. I spoke less of doctrine and more of experience. I urged them to look not only outward toward the heavens, but inward toward their own fragile hearts. Do not fear your wounds, I told them. They are the doors through which the beloved enters. To hide your pain is to hide from grace. Often, after the lessons, I would walk among the city's narrow streets, where the colors and smells and sounds pressed close. I saw the faces of people, the young and old, the joyous and suffering, with fresh eyes. Each bore invisible wounds, some obvious, others carefully concealed. I began to greet strangers with a quiet reverence, sensing in their gazes the unspoken stories of pain and endurance. I no longer felt separate from them, but bound by the shared reality of human frailty. In that fellowship of broken souls, I found a deep and abiding joy. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills and the sky blushed with shades of purple and gold, I sat by the fire with a small circle of friends and seekers. The air was filled with the scent of burning wood and the soft murmur of voices. We spoke of the divine, of mysteries, of the path. At one point, a young man asked, "Master, how do we know when the light truly enters us?" I looked into his eager, searching eyes and replied, "You will know because it will come through your wound. The place where you are most vulnerable, where you have been most broken, will become the window through which the light shines. It is not the absence of pain, but the presence of love within pain." As the years passed, the wound never fully healed, nor did I wish it to. It had become part of me, a sacred scar, a holy threshold. I learned that the soul's growth is not measured by how quickly it closes its wounds, but by how courageously it keeps them open. The light, after all, does not enter through walls of stone and steel, but through cracks and openings, through places tender enough to receive it. And so I live still, carrying this wound with me, not as a burden but as a blessing. It is the place where I meet myself, where I meet others, where I meet the divine. The wound is my doorway, my prayer, my song. Yes, the wound is the place where the light enters you. In the stillness of those long nights, when the world seemed to hold its breath between one heartbeat and the next, I found myself drawn deeper into the sacred presence of my wound. It was no longer merely a place of pain or a source of sorrow. It had become a living sanctuary within me, a hollowed space carved out by loss and longing, where the divine's light could enter and dance freely. I remember sitting on the worn wooden floor of my chamber, the faint scent of rosewater lingering in the air, the flicker of a single candle casting shadows that seemed to move like spirits upon the walls. In that quiet refuge, I began to listen, to truly listen, not to the teachings I had so long studied, nor to the familiar verses I had committed to memory, but to the subtle language of the wound itself. The wound spoke in silence and sighs, in the trembling of the heart and the tears that flowed unbidden. It taught me that suffering was not an enemy to be defeated, but a companion to be embraced. It revealed that beneath the sharpness of pain there lay a tenderness so profound it could reshape the soul. I learned that to close the wound was to close the door to illumination, that the very crack in my being was the secret passage through which grace traveled. This truth unsettled me at first. I had been taught to seek wholeness, to mend what was broken, to perfect the self. Yet the wound insisted otherwise. It said that perfection was a veil, that wholeness came not from absence of brokenness, but from the willingness to dwell within it. I thought of the countless moments in my life when I had tried to run from pain, when I had hidden my grief beneath sermons, when I had silenced my longing with learned words, when I had built walls of knowledge to keep out the chaos of feeling. Those defenses now seemed fragile and futile. The wound demanded a new way of being, one of openness, humility, and trust. I understood that this openness was not weakness, but a fierce courage, a bold invitation to life in its rawest form. Each night, as I sat with the wound, the memories that surfaced were like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes overwhelming. I recalled the laughter of my mother, now forever silent, the uncertain steps of my youth, the faces of those I had loved and lost. Rather than retreat from these memories, I welcomed them into the hollow of my heart, allowing them to sing their sorrow and their sweetness. In doing so, I felt a kinship with all who suffer, a thread of shared humanity woven through the tapestry of existence. The wound also taught me about presence. It showed me that healing is not always a journey outward, but often a descent inward, a pilgrimage into the depths of oneself where truth resides beyond words. I came to see that presence with another person's pain, with their brokenness, was itself a sacred act. I practiced this presence in my teachings, in my conversations, in the silent moments shared with those who came seeking comfort. Sometimes there were no words, only shared breath and the stillness that honors grief. And in that stillness, light often flickered and grew. I remember one night, not long after this shift in my understanding, a traveler arrived at my door. His eyes were clouded with sorrow, his steps heavy with despair. He spoke little but sat with me for hours, allowing the silence between us to unfold like a prayer. As the candle burned low, he finally spoke. how do I bear this wound that will not heal? I answered not with doctrine, but with my own truth. Do not seek to close the wound, for it is the place where the beloved enters. Carry it gently, and let it teach you the language of love. Tears gathered in his eyes, and I knew that in the sharing of our wounds, we had found a glimpse of the divine. In the months and years that followed, the wound remained a faithful companion, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, always alive. It shaped my poetry and my prayers, my teachings, and my walks through the city's winding streets. It deepened my empathy and sharpened my awareness of the delicate beauty hidden in every human heart. The wound was no longer a source of fear or shame, but a sacred passage, an invitation to live fully, to love deeply, to receive the light even when it shines through pain. I understood, finally, that life itself is a series of wounds and lights, and that to be truly alive is to embrace both, to open oneself not only to joy but to sorrow, not only to certainty but to mystery. The wound is the place where the light enters you, yes, but it is also the place where you begin to see with new eyes, hear with new ears, and love with a heart that is both broken and whole. And so, in the deep silence of that night, as the candle guttered and the stars moved slowly across the sky, I whispered a prayer from the depths of my soul. Beloved, keep this wound open. Let the light pour in. Let me be a vessel for your mercy and your love, a humble bearer of the sacred crack through which all grace flows. The wound inside me was no fleeting shadow, but a permanent companion, a silent pulse that marked every moment of my existence. It had become a place where light, the most delicate and profound light, entered, not as a blazing sun, but as a quiet glow that softened the edges of my soul and revealed the beauty hidden within the brokenness. This light was subtle and tender, coaxing me to see the world anew, to understand that suffering was not a curse to escape but a sacred threshold to cross. Each day, I awakened more aware of this mysterious alchemy, that from the depths of pain, the soul's truest illumination arises. In the morning stillness, before the city stirred to life, I would walk through the garden surrounding my home, where dew clung to every blade of grass and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and rose. These walks became rituals of reverence, moments to honor the wound as a holy place, a temple carved into my being by loss and longing. I would pause often, my gaze resting on a flower battered by rain or a branch bowed beneath its own weight, and in their imperfect grace, I recognized reflections of my own soul. The garden, too, knew the language of endurance and transformation, that to bloom was to risk being broken, and to be broken was to invite new life. My teaching changed profoundly as this understanding deepened. No longer did I seek to instill certainty or offer easy answers. Instead, I invited my students to meet their own wounds, to sit with their questions and fears without rushing to judgment or solution. The wound, I told them, is not a sign of failure but a gateway. It is the place where the divine reaches down to touch us, where the heart becomes wide enough to receive love beyond measure. Some embraced this message eagerly, others struggled, afraid to confront the pain within. But all who truly listened found themselves drawn into a new kind of learning, one rooted not in doctrine but in experience, not in knowing but in being. One evening, a man arrived at my door, his face marked by years of hardship and eyes clouded with sorrow. He had lost his family, his home, his place in the world, and carried a wound as deep as my own. We sat together by the fire, and he spoke haltingly of despair, of a darkness that seemed impenetrable. I shared with him my truth, that the wound is not an end but a beginning, that the light enters most brightly through the cracks in our souls. I told him, do not fear the darkness inside you, for it is the very space where the beloved waits. As we sat in that quiet communion, I saw a flicker of hope kindle in his eyes, and I knew that the sacred dance of wound and light had begun anew. In my poetry, I sought to capture this dance, the fragile interplay of breaking and healing, loss and love, shadow and illumination. Words flowed like water from a spring deep within, each verse a prayer, a confession, a celebration. I wrote of the wound as the threshold where the soul is born again, where silence speaks and the heart opens to the infinite. My verses became a mirror reflecting the sacred paradox that to be broken is to be made whole, that to suffer is to be chosen for the deepest intimacy with the divine. The wound taught me about time, too, that it is not a straight path but a spiral, returning us again and again to the same lessons, each time with deeper understanding. It showed me the power of presence, the grace of simply being with another's pain, without trying to fix or explain. I learned that healing is not about erasing the wound, but about living with it fully, allowing it to shape us into vessels of compassion and wisdom. And so, day by day, the wound remained, not as a scar to hide, but as a sacred place to honor. It opened me to the world and to others, teaching me that love and light do not come despite our brokenness, but because of it. The wound is the place where the light enters you, transforming sorrow into grace, fracture into beauty, and pain into the very pulse of life itself. In those quiet nights, when the world around me settled into stillness and the only sounds were the distant murmurs of the city and the steady flicker of my candle's flame, I would sit with the wound open before me, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a sacred doorway. The wound had become a living, breathing space inside me, a hollow chamber carved out by grief and loss, yet filled with an unexpected light that shimmered softly, like dawn breaking through the darkest night. This light was not harsh or blinding. It was gentle and persistent, weaving its way through the cracks of my broken heart, illuminating corners of my soul I had long neglected or feared. I realized then that the wound was not simply a place of suffering, but a threshold to transformation. It taught me that healing was not about erasing pain or restoring a false sense of wholeness, but about allowing the self to be opened more fully to love and grace. The wound was a channel, an invitation for the divine to enter, to meet me in my fragility and to transform it into something radiant and new. Each time the pain returned, it came not only to remind me of loss, but to offer a deeper revelation that vulnerability is the root of true strength, and that light and darkness are inseparable partners in the dance of the soul. There were moments when the ache was almost unbearable, when the wound felt like a raw nerve exposed to the cold wind of solitude and despair. But in those moments, I learned to lean not away from the pain, but into it, to breathe with it and to allow it to teach me patience and humility. I would remember the face of the young girl whose silence had first cracked my heart, the way her sorrow had opened a space within me that could never again be filled by words alone. Her grief had been a mirror, reflecting back to me the depths of my own brokenness and the beginnings of my healing. In the quiet solitude of my chamber, I wrote poetry that poured from the wellspring of this wound, a sacred outpouring of the soul that spoke not only of pain, but of beauty born from brokenness, of love blossoming through loss, of light shining from within the shadow. My verses became prayers, and my prayers became songs that carried the essence of this truth, that the wound is the place where the light enters you. Through these words, I sought to share the gift I had received, not a promise of easy healing, but an invitation to live with open hearts, to trust in the mystery of transformation, and to find grace in every fracture. My teachings changed as well. I no longer spoke solely of law and theology, nor of distant truths to be understood with the mind alone. Instead, I invited those who came to me to meet their wounds with courage, to embrace the places where they felt broken and vulnerable. I taught that it is precisely through these wounds that the soul grows, that the divine draws near, and that love becomes most real. In the presence of this shared brokenness, fear and shame began to dissolve, replaced by compassion and connection. I saw this in the faces of those who sought me out, faces marked by their own sorrows, yet shining with newfound hope. I remember sitting beside an old woman who had lost her only son, her grief silent but palpable. We sat in silence for hours, the wound between us a sacred space where words were unnecessary. In that silence, healing began, not as a cure, but as a presence, a shared breath of love that transcended pain. The wound taught me about time, too, that it is not a line to be crossed, but a spiral to be traveled again and again, each pass revealing deeper truths. It showed me that life's darkest moments are not detours or punishments, but part of the sacred path, each break a turning point inviting us into fuller awakening. The wound revealed the paradox that to be broken is to be opened, to suffer is to be chosen, to be vulnerable is to be strong. And so, with each day that passed, I carried my wound not as a weight to be hidden, but as a light to be honored. It was the door through which the beloved entered, the sacred crack where grace flowed in and made me whole in my brokenness. I understood, finally, that life's deepest truth is found not beyond pain but within it, that the wound is the place where the light enters you, transforming sorrow into wisdom, fracture into beauty, and death into new life. In this truth, I found peace. In this openness, I found love. And in this journey, I found myself, broken, glowing, and utterly alive. In the endless unfolding of time, as days melted into nights and seasons whispered their quiet transformations, I came to embrace the wound within me not as a fleeting trial, but as a lifelong companion, a sacred landscape etched deeply into the terrain of my soul. It was no longer a simple injury or sorrow, but a living, breathing testament to the paradox of existence, that through breaking we become whole, and through pain we are made radiant. This wound was a doorway, carved by suffering and illuminated by grace, through which the divine continually beckoned me to enter ever more fully into the mystery of life. Each morning, as the sun painted the sky with hues of rose and gold, would rise with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying this wound as both a burden and a blessing. It shaped the rhythm of my days and colored the songs of my heart. Walking through the gardens near my home, I found reflections of my own journey in the fragile blossoms bent beneath the weight of dew and storm. Their resilience spoke to me, the way they bowed and yet persisted, how even in bruising they retained their beauty. So too, I learned, the soul bears its scars not in vain but as marks of endurance and transformation. In the quiet moments of contemplation, I felt the wound as a sacred hollow within me, a holy emptiness ready to receive the light. This light was not always easy to discern. It came softly, like the first star in the evening sky or the faintest glow before dawn. Yet it was persistent, patient, and unyielding in its pursuit of my heart. I came to understand that this light was the divine's presence, entering not through strength or perfection, but through vulnerability and openness. The wound was the portal that invited this grace in, and in doing so, it changed everything. My teachings evolved alongside this realization. No longer did I speak only of doctrines and sacred texts. Instead, I spoke of wounds and healing, of the courage to remain open when the world would have us close our hearts. To my students, I said, do not fear your brokenness, for it is the place where the beloved enters. In your wounds lies the source of your deepest compassion and your greatest strength. Some received these words with joy, others with hesitation, but all were invited into a new way of knowing, one that honored the sacred interplay of suffering and love. I witnessed the power of this truth in the lives of those who came to me seeking solace. Faces lined with hardship, eyes shadowed by grief, yet softened by the flicker of hope. I shared in their pain without judgment, offering the presence of one who carried his own wounds openly. In that shared vulnerability, a healing began, a quiet alchemy that transformed isolation into connection, despair into trust. I realized that the wound, far from being a source of shame, was a bridge, a sacred space where human hearts meet and the divine's light flows freely between them. One evening, beneath a canopy of stars, a weary traveler found me in my garden. His spirit was heavy with loss, his steps faltering under the weight of unseen burdens. We spoke little at first, but as the night deepened, he asked, "How does one live when the wound never heals?" I looked into his eyes and answered with the truth that had become my own. The wound remains, but it becomes a place of light, a window through which the beloved enters. Peace is found not in the closing of the wound, but in the opening of the heart. A faint smile broke through his sorrow, and I knew that in this shared moment, the sacred dance of brokenness and grace had begun. In the solitude of my chamber, I poured these reflections into poetry, each verse a prayer and an offering. I wrote of the wound as the holy fissure where sorrow is transformed into wisdom, where loss blooms into love, where the soul is born anew. These words were not merely my own, but a universal song, a call to all who suffer to embrace their brokenness and trust in the light that flows through it. Through poetry, I sought to illuminate the path from despair to hope, from fragmentation to wholeness. The wound also taught me about time, not as a linear march, but as a spiral dance, returning us to the same lessons with ever-deepening insight. It revealed that life's darkest moments are not detours from the path, but integral steps along it, that every fracture is an invitation to awaken more fully. The wound showed me that vulnerability is not weakness but the birthplace of courage, that to be broken is to be chosen for a deeper intimacy with the divine. So I walked forward, carrying my wound not as a mark of defeat but as a sign of transformation. It was a constant reminder that life's greatest gifts often come wrapped in pain, that the deepest beauty arises from our most profound brokenness. The wound was my teacher, my companion, my sacred doorway. Through it, I was drawn ever closer to the beloved, to the light that shines beyond all darkness. The wound remains, and so does the light, intertwined, inseparable, eternal. In the endless passage of time, I found that the wound within me was not merely a mark of suffering or a fleeting sorrow, but a living, breathing presence, a sacred chamber carved deep into the fabric of my being, where the divine's light entered softly and transformed everything it touched. This wound was no longer a source of shame or fear, but a holy doorway, an invitation to a deeper communion with the mystery of existence. As the years flowed on like a river carrying both joy and grief, I learned to carry this wound with a reverence born not of resignation, but of awakening. It was the place where my soul was broken open, shattered not to destroy, but to reveal the infinite light hidden beneath the surface of pain. Each dawn, as the sun spilled gold across the ancient city and the call to prayer echoed through the streets, I rose with a heart both tender and strong, carrying the memory of my wound like a flame held gently in the palm. Walking through gardens heavy with jasmine and rose, I saw in every petal's delicate curve the paradox of life itself, the intertwining of fragility and resilience, beauty and loss. The wound within me mirrored these gardens, places once trampled by storms, now fertile grounds for new growth. I learned that just as the earth must be broken to receive the seed, so too must the heart be opened by the crack of sorrow to welcome the light of grace. This understanding changed how I taught and lived. No longer did I present myself as a master of knowledge or a keeper of sacred laws. Instead, I became a fellow traveler, a witness to the human condition in all its broken glory. I invited those who came to me to look honestly at their own wounds, to hold them with courage and tenderness. Do not seek to close the wound too quickly, I would say, for it is the place where the beloved enters. In your brokenness lies the path to your deepest wholeness. Some heard these words with hope, others trembled before the vulnerability they demanded. But all were called to step into the sacred dance of shadow and light. I remember a night under a sky thick with stars when a young woman came to sit beside me, her spirit weighed down by grief so deep it seemed to still her breath. She spoke of loss so profound it had hollowed her heart, leaving only silence in its wake. I took her hand in mine and whispered, "Your wound is not a prison, but a temple. Let it remain open, so that the light may enter and transform your sorrow into wisdom." As tears traced quiet paths down her face, I saw in her eyes the flicker of a new life beginning, a fragile but fierce hope born from the sacred acceptance of pain. The wound taught me much about time and transformation. It revealed that healing is not a destination but a spiral journey, returning us again and again to the same places with greater depth and clarity. It showed me that the soul's true work is not to be made perfect but to be made transparent, to become a vessel through which love flows freely, despite the cracks and fractures. I came to see that vulnerability is the wellspring of courage, that our most profound strength lies in our willingness to be seen as we truly are, broken, beautiful, and endlessly loved. In my poetry, this truth found its purest voice. The verses flowed from the depths of the wound, carrying with them the bittersweet melody of loss and grace intertwined. I wrote not to hide the pain, but to illuminate it, to sing the song of the soul's resilience, the dance of light breaking through darkness. My words became an offering, a beacon for those who wandered through their own valleys of shadow, reminding them that the wound is the place where the light enters. Through this journey, I discovered the heart of love itself, not the love that demands perfection or denies pain, but the love that embraces the whole of our being, the light and the shadow, the broken and the healed. The wound was my gateway to this love, the threshold where I met the beloved not as a distant ideal, but as a presence near and dear, holding me in all my fragility and strength. And so, I walk still with this wound open before me, a constant companion and sacred gift. It reminds me that life's deepest mysteries unfold not beyond suffering but within it, that the soul's greatest light shines most brightly through the cracks of our brokenness. The wound is the place where the light enters you, transforming pain into grace, fracture into beauty, and loss into the eternal dance of love. This is the truth I carry in my heart, the story I share with the world, the legacy of a soul awakened by its own sacred brokenness.